Welcome at the second part of the webinar Making the Transition from WebForms to MVC. In the first part I've set up the layout razor template for the global look and feel of the ExpressMe MVC version. I've also showed and built the architecture of the application by setting up a small reusable hierarchy for the controllers, the DTO classes and the view model classes. At the end of the first part, I have showed you how to use the DevExpress Data View MVC extension as well as the Callback panel and the menu extension. The result of part 1 is a homepage which shows the blog posts in exactly the same way as the WebForms version. Here we have the WebForms version and here we have the MVC version. In this part, I will implement the Popup control for inserting and editing blog posts, the blog post detail page and the page to display posts by groups. Let's get back to Visual Studio. Let me insert the Popup control extension, and this will be inserted in the layout razor file. So I'll locate the layout file here, and as you can see, the WebForms version of the Popup control is commented out in this code. And on exactly the same spot I want the Popup extension to appear. For this I will use the MVC extension wizard, and in the section Navigation and Layout you will find the Popup control. I will give it a name, and that name is going to be DX-. The rest of the properties can be set here. I will not do too much with it because I will override the properties by code. They should be the same as the properties in the WebForms Popup control version. So if I hit insert, you will see that the Popup control is rendered directly inside the layout file. That is not exactly what I want. I want to have it in a partial view. So I will move this code over to a partial view. This partial view will be rendered here, and that is done by using the html.action method. And let me insert that in the partial dashboard partial. This is not actually the name of the partial, but this will be an action method on the controller which will render in that partial. So for that we will also need to make a small modification in the controller. But I'll do that later. I will first finish off the partial, the display layer, and then put some code in the controller. Because we're going to use this pop-up on every page, I'm going to put it in the shared folder, and I'll create a new view, and it's going to be called dashboard partial. I'm just going to mark it as create as partial view and let it be created. Here is the partial, which is completely empty. I'll now go back to the layout and just get this code and cut it from here and paste it in here. As you can see, there are only a couple of properties set, while in the WebForms version there are quite a bit of properties set. Well, fortunately I can make those properties exactly the same by putting in some code here. These properties are basically all used in the WebForms version as well. I have used pop-up settings, so I'll change this as well, and that means that I will also need to change this one. And this setContent method will render the content of the pop-up. I will not use the pop-up settings.setContent because in the WebForms version I have used a pop-up window which is inside the pop-up control, so I will do that as well. But before I can do that, let me first create such a pop-up window, and that is being done by the following line of code. I will just create that new MVC pop-up window, and instead of the pop-up settings set content, I will use the insert popup.set content. And obviously we will need to write some code in here. In the end of this method, I will also need to add that window to the pop-up control, and that is being done by the following code. As you can see, I'll get the pop-up settings object, which has a Windows collection, and I'll just call the add method to insert new pop-up. Besides the set content, we also need to set the footer of the pop-up window, and that can be done by the following method, because the insert pop-up has a method which is called set footer content. And as you can see, I will render in another partial here, and that partial I have on purpose inserted a partial just to show you how much similar the MVC extensions are with the WebForms version. I will literally use the same code as the footer in the WebForms version. I will obviously need to create that footer. Let me first get back to the content. This will not be appropriate. There is one important difference between MVC and WebForms. In WebForms, when we have a pop-up control and we put a couple of edit controls on there, after we do a callback on this pop-up control, the form values are automatically submitted back through the callback method. In MVC, that's not the same. If you have looked closely to the layout file, you'll notice that there is not even one single form tag in this entire file. While with WebForms, you will need explicitly one form tag inside your code, and then everything will work. That's also the reason that we are unable to submit those values back. So in MVC you can use a couple of approaches, like going through all the controls, get all their values and create a JSON object from it and post that back through Ajax or whatever. What we can also do is use the Ajax form. And the Ajax form will render a form tag, and it will include a bit of script which will make sure that all the form values which are inside that form are being submitted through Ajax. So let us use that approach in the pop-up, because in this situation it's the most easy thing to do. So if I go back to the dashboard partial, I will need to render that form. And that Ajax form is pretty much the same as rendering a normal form in MVC. The way that that's being done is by calling or by using a using construct. And this means that when this method is called in on the front end when rendering, the form tag will be rendered with a couple of parameters and a couple of things here. I'll come to that a bit later. And when we exit the using construct, that will mean that the thing that was being created in the using will be disposed, and that means that in the HTML the form close tag will be written down. And with the Ajax form it's exactly the same. Everything what we do between this using will be rendered inside that form tag. Well, I've specified a number of options with the Ajax options parameter. I want it to be posted, and in the onComplete, so when the callback has been completed, a JavaScript function should be executed. and that will be just JavaScript function. This is a slight change in the WebForms version, because in the WebForms version we were using the end callback method of the Popup control. But because we are unable in that approach to get the form values to the server, I have created an Ajax dashboard form end method, which I will insert in the express.me JavaScript file. Furthermore, it needs an update target ID, which is some HTML container with this ID. And this option means that the content of that update target will be replaced. So now we have the form set up, and we can write the div with which was specified at the update target ID. For this I could create a partial view, but I have decided to write it down by using the view context.writer.write, and this will just write the div with the specified ID. This will also mean that I will need to close down that div. So that can be done by just copying this code and remove all the extra stuff here and do the close tag. So I have written down this ID. I will also write something in already that we haven't discussed yet, but a bit further down the road we're going to need it anyway, because I need, in case of editing an existing blog post, I will need the edit ID or the ID of the current edited blog. So what I can do here is I will check whether the model ID equals width.empty. If that's the case, we can assume it's a new post, so then I don't need it. And when it is not empty, I expect it to be an ID of the block being edited, and I will write down a hidden input type with the specified ID. Once this has been done, we could now write the form control here. I have chosen, because of the complexity of this control, to write down to render a partial for it, and I have a specific partial which will contain the form layout control. Well, it is now giving me a bit of a curly thing here, which means that something is not okay, and that is because I haven't specified the, let me quickly check, I haven't specified the model on the top of the view. So let me specify the model type it is expecting, just like this. Now you'll see that everything is okay and that everything is parsed okay. So once this has been done, let me first get back to the controller. In this case it will be the home controller, because what I mentioned earlier, I am using the HTML.action, and that means that there should be a method, an action method in the controller, which will have the name dashboard partial. So let me get back to the home controller, and let me do a quick check. So right here we should return that actual partial view, and the code which will be executed there is pretty short. It will basically do the same as the post view partial. It will just return a partial view with the dashboard partial, and I am binding something to it. Let me indent it correctly. So this partial view will be bound to a new post details model, and this new post details model is not completed right now because this class doesn't exist yet. And I talked about this really short in the first webinar. I'm gonna create a derived class from the PostModel, which will only have one thing changed. So let me go to the model folder and add a new class, and that new class is going to be called PostDetailer model. This class is going to be derived from PostModel, and I will override a property which is called isCompact. So let me override that property, and it will now return true, false, because we now want to have the extended version. Let me put it on one line since it's such a simple statement. I should also not forget to implement the constructors for this class, because otherwise we will run into some problems later on. This can be done by accessing the Code Rush menu and just select Add Missing Constructors, just like this. There is one other thing that I would like to override, and that is the assign from, because what we also need to do is, if I switch back to the WebForms version, which is here, let me go back to the home page and let me get one of the very first blog posts here, which is for instance this. You will see at the details, let me cancel it, it will have the title here, it will have the post at and by there, it will have the group, and it will have the article. If I go to more, you will see that there is some more stuff inserted here, which is the tags. While we are not going to code in the tag functionality right now, basically this means that we will need those tags. And also if there are any images, so let me check the holidays one, and I think that we might have, I did have some images at some stage, but I've been testing quite a bit. Yeah, here we've got the images, so in case we're on a detail, so when we are not compact, it would render the tags and the images. And that is something I'm going to implement in this code as well, and that can be done by overriding the assign from. Because in the base, in the PostModel class, I wasn't doing anything with the tags as well as the attachments. But what I'll do now is I will put in this code, which will load in the tags, and it will also load in the attachments, just like this. So that is another specific feature in the PostDetailer model. If I now go back to the home controller, I can simply resolve this. Let me check, I must have created a little typing error here. It was going to be the PostDetails model, and then I obviously need to change it in the constructors as well, and I'm going to use Code Rush to rename the file even. I'm going to say rename file to match type, so it's going to be renamed to PostDetails. If I now go back to the home controller, you'll see that it can be resolved and that everything appears to be okay. The dashboard parser will be loaded, and because we are on the home page, we're going to insert a new blog post, so I can safely say I will bind it to a new PostDetails model. That was one thing that we needed to do in the controller. I will now switch back to the dashboard partial, because there were a couple of things there which we need to implement as well. One of them is the dashboard footer partial. the most easy way is, because I'm rendering this and I've coded it by hand, not using any of the wizards or stuff, I'm going to create the dashboard footer partial also by hand. And that's just done by creating a new view, give it a name, and tick the create as partial view. Here's my empty dashboard footer partial. And while we're creating partials anyway, let me create this one as well. This will contain the form layout. So I will do the same and say add a new view, give it a name, tick the create as partial view, and here we've got an empty form layout partial as well. If we take a look at the footer, I'm first going to implement the footer. So if I'm going to take a look at the WebForms version, in the custom controls folder we have the Popup footer. And what you see here is a simple div, a spacer div, and two divs containing the OK button and the other one containing the cancel button. I also have put the client-side events in the JavaScript file here, so we have the Popup cancel button click and the Popup OK button click. What I will do in the view, the partial view, if I go back to the dashboard footer partial, I will use the following code for that. And what I will show you is that it will be exactly the same, except for the server controls. What I do here is I have this Popup footer, and if I put it next to each other, that might make a bit more sense. I'm going to create a vertical group, and what you can see here, if I put it both here, is more or less the same, with the exception that I'm using the DevExpress MVC extension here and the DevExpress MVC extension here for the cancel button. The rest of the properties is identical. Also, the Popup cancel button click and the OK button click. I do need to change one thing in the Popup OK button click in the JavaScript, but we'll get to that a bit later. So that's the reason that I wanted to show, because those DevExpress MVC extensions are functionality wise literally the same as the WebForms counterpart. So let me close down this and let me get to the JavaScript file, because we need to make a couple of small changes here. The Popup OK button click, let me copy this so I can look it up in the JavaScript file. The Popup OK button click in this case does a perform callback on the pop-up window, but that is something that we have changed by implementing the Ajax form. So the code which is in here should be slightly different, and it should send over that form. So what are we going to change then? Let me first comment out the existing code. So we'll have it as a reference. What we need to do is we need to locate the dashboard form and we need to submit it. And by using the jQuery operator, it is fortunately very simple to do. I will just look that dashboard form up, that was the ID of the dashboard form, and I'll call submit. And this form will make sure that it's being submitted by Ajax, so we will not do a post of the entire page. Then there was also one other thing that we needed to change. So if I go back to the dashboard partial, I was mentioning that we have this Ajax dashboard form end, and we need to add that method, and we only need to move a few lines of code from one other event. to this new method. Let me get back to the express.me JavaScript file, and I'm going to add this new method. So I'm going to do this exactly like the other ones. Equals function, and I will close this down by a semicolon. So we need to remove some code out of the Popup control and callback. And what we need to move out is this code. And this code is not going to be used anymore in this method, so I can also comment that out. Just like this. It will now complain a bit about this, and obviously this. So this should be the only thing what needs to be done in the control and callback. Let me get back and paste that code in here. So I will locate the window, and I will do the same mechanism that I used in the WebForms version. That does remind me that I made one slight mistake by commenting out everything. That's not entirely true, but let me still comment out everything because I will need some smaller changes here. The code, I will put this code completely new in so you can still see what it was. I should locate that window, but I will now check if it is not visible, then it should show that window. So this is the other change in the JavaScript that we need to make. All that being done, we can now continue going to the form layout partial to insert the form. And this can be done in several ways. I can just say HTML DevExpress form layout, and that will give me some form settings, object, and I can now start coding in all those settings. This is a bit of work, and also if you use the wizard, let me show you. So I'll remove this and I'll say insert the extension. If I go a bit down here, then you'll notice it's not in here. So it will probably be in here. And there we are. But as you can see, you can set a number of properties, but the items which are rendered inside the form layout still needs to be coded by hand. So that is a bit of a tricky job, and it's going to take some time. I will not do that all by hand for you, but I will just put in some code and explain a bit what it does. But it's mostly initialization code. So what needs to be in there? I will start by specifying a model. The model that we are expecting is a PostModel, and I will put in a couple of properties which are pretty much doable because they are not that much. Let me also close down this code already, that I know that it's complete. What needs to be done now is we're gonna render in or configure all the controls that are inside this form layout. And if I switch back and hit the hash, you will see that we're dealing with a text box, an active box, a combo box, the tags I would leave out for now, summary, and upload control. And the upload control is also not going to be in this webinar. So basically we need a couple of controls. And how does that work? As said, I specified the model of this view should be of the type PostModel. And what I can do now is I can first put in the title. So the form settings has an items collection, basically just like the WebForms version. The only thing that I change is that I will start with a lambda expression which will bind the title of the model which is bound to this layout, form layout. It will bind the title to this control. Furthermore, I will set a number of things like what kind of editor are we going to use, and in this case it will be a text box. I will specify a title. I will set the width to 100%, and then there are some specific text box settings which I will create. Well, basically I will cast the item settings nested extension settings because I have specified a text box type here, and then I can be sure that the nested extension settings is a text box settings object. And here I can specify things like validation settings. You could obviously also use unobtrusive JavaScript validation, but that's going to be explained in another webinar coming soon. And I'm going to specify a number of other things. Well, I will do the same for the active one. I will not spend too much time on that because that's only a checkbox. What I'll do here is I will bind it to the model.active property. I will specify the checkbox here and also the checkbox settings. The next is pretty interesting because that's going to be a combo box, and right in the beginning, I will come back to that in any minute. So let me first do the same. I'm binding it to the group, which is the grid. If I go back to the PostModel, let me see, the PostModel is here, and I had the conversion from XPO group to the key. Well, this is the reason I am doing this conversion, because if I switch back to this items, then this grid will be put in as the value. Then there is another interesting thing, because I will specify the ComboBox settings. I will create a settings object, and I need to bind the drop down portion of this ComboBox to some list with all available groups. And that is another interesting part with MVC and the DevExpress MVC extensions, because if I switch back to the PostModel, you might remember that I have included a number of IEnumerable properties, and in this case the lookup groups. So what I can do now is I can bind that data source to the lookup groups, and I'll just specify the ID and the title as value in the text field, and this will bind my data source to all available groups. Then the last form item I will add is the article one. I will not spend too much time on that as well, because the only thing which is different is it's going to be a memo, and I will also put in by using this lambda expression, I will put in the memo the article text. The last thing that I will need to check is that I will obviously need to bind this form layout. So I need to change that. I need to bind it to the model which is used to render this partial view, which will be one of the blog articles or a new one, and get the HTML. So this will render our form inside a pop-up, and it will bind in case of an existing blog item. Before we can see the pop-up in action, there is one other thing which needs to be addressed. In the WebForms webinars, I have talked about the fact that I wanted the pop-up to render its content during a callback. I want the same to happen in the MVC version. So there should be some code somewhere on the server side which will initialize the form. How is that being done? Well, let's get back to the dashboard partial. And I skipped over that pretty fast. You'll see that I have the callback route values, where I pass on the current controller and I will pass on an action. And this action is an action method inside the controller which will be executed once a dashboard perform window callback will be executed from your browser. I will also pass in an ID, and in our case that will be an empty one because we are dealing with a new block item, but this will be added because of the functionality we're going to add a bit later. So if I go back to the home controller, we'll need to insert that method. It's going to be an action result method, and that method should have the name dashboard callback. So let me put it in and tell you what it does. There is a really cool MVC feature in here. I have this action result dashboard callback, and this method has one parameter which is a PostModel type, but as you can see, this parameter is decorated with a model binder attribute, and this model binder attribute is a really nice feature in MVC because some data is submitted through the callback and that will be entered in this method eventually, but because of the model binder, the data being sent back will be transformed into this PostModel object. So it is like a complex thing which goes on, and the form data which will be submitted back, it will match properties inside the PostModel object in this case, and it will do some magic, and in the end you will have, if everything is okay, a pre-filled post object. And this is also a reason why I have used the data transformation classes inside this MVC project, because if this would be a direct XPO object, that could be done, but it would not be as fast because we need to assign some session, some unit of work to that object, and we need to do all kinds of complicated stuff, while the approach that we're dealing with here is much faster and it's much simpler. So this post object will always be an empty one because we are dealing with the home controller which creates new blog posts. But what I do need to do anyway is, we were just talking about the ComboBox and the groups which will be bound to the data source, so we will need to fill that groups collection, and that's just done by using a link query, and it will query all the groups. I will insert another one which says select group, and I will then assign that list to the lookup groups. I have done the same for the lookup tags, but as said, we will not be dealing with it in this webinar, so I'll leave the code in, but I'm not going to do anything with it. In the end, I will return the partial view just as the dashboard pop-up, but I will pass on that post object with its groups populated. So this is one of the nice things in MVC, specifically that model binding technology is a really cool feature, I have to say. So once we have done this, we can also immediately do something else. Because if I go back to the dashboard partial, there is something else. We have talked about the Ajax form, and that will be submitted to dashboard submit. That means that inside the controller we should also have an action method dashboard submit, and that will handle the posted data, so that will handle everything that you entered, and it should do the actual insert inside the database. How does that work? Well, it works as cool as the previous action method. So let me get back to the home controller and begin on a new line, And what I'll do, I will insert that code. It's really simple code because of the model binding technology. So I will paste it in and explain what it does. Basically what happens, I've got the same parameter decorated with this attribute. So try to visualize. Once you have entered the data, it will be submitted through AJAX to the server. The MVC framework picks it up, it redirects it to this particular controller, to this particular action method, and because of the model binding stuff that we have configured, the data that you've entered will be transformed into a post object, which is the DTO class. What I can do now, I can do a couple of simple validations. Here I could do more validations and I could do whatever I like. But finally, because we are dealing with an insert in the database, I can just call the DB insert, which we created in the home controller. And as you can see, this will get that XPO based DTO model, which was generic, and I can pass in that post, which was constructed by the model binder. And we can use this post because in the declaration of the controller we have specified the first generic type to be of the type XPO post. So the actual insert is pretty simple. What we can do now is we have to return something in this submit as well, and I will just return the partial view with the post that was currently inserted. That post doesn't matter that much anyway, because once you click the plus again, we will first be dealing with this dashboard callback, which will reinitialize the content anyway, and you will get a new post, empty post object. So this is just for, yeah, we need to pass something, and with this method also implemented, we can run the application and we can insert a new post. So here we are, and once the application is started up, I'll hit the plus, I'll get the pop-up, and I'll say this is a very new post. I'll make it active and I'll put it in the group holidays or something, and I will enter some really interesting information here, just like this. And remember, when I hit OK, this method here will be executed. I should have run the application in debug mode so I could actually show you. You know what, I'm going to just run the application again because I just want you to see this. So I will set the breakpoint here, so nothing exciting has happened yet. This is in the submit, so once I hit the OK button, we will get back to the debugger, and let me insert a new item, a new debugged item. I'll make it active, I'll select the group, test group. This item has been added in debug mode. So try to visualize what I just have been building. When I hit the OK, this form will be submitted through AJAX and it will be trapped on my breakpoint. Here is my breakpoint, and I have done nothing yet. I mean, we have only submitted that form through JavaScript. So if I take a peek inside this post object, and you know what, let me do that here. The post object was quite simple, so I can just expand it. Let me make it a bit bigger. And as you can see, the title, let me make the values a bit bigger. As you can see, the title is filled in with the stuff that I entered in the text box. Also, the article has been done, and the active checkbox, or the active property, has been done. And the way that this has been done is thanks to this model binding technology, which is inside the MVC framework. And you can do some pretty sophisticated stuff with that, as you can imagine. And the thing is that you will only be working with objects inside the server side of MVC, and I think this is like a really cool feature. But anyway, so if I let me remove the breakpoint and run any further, it will now give me an error, and it says that a public action method nav container callback was not found. And that is not really a big deal, but it is more or less the same issue as I was anticipating on in the form. For some reason I didn't implement this nav container callback method. So let me copy this code, because it could also be a typo from my side. So this means that the callback on the, let me go back to the diagram. Where was it? Here. So remember, if I switch back to the previous page, this callback panel is trying to repopulate the menu, and that's not going to happen because it can't find the callback method. So that's probably not a really big deal. So let me break the application, and I'm going to take a quick look, because we have implemented that behavior in the home controller, the base controller. And as you can see, there is the navigation partial, but I didn't do the nav container callback. So that was not the brightest thing to do. So what I'll do here is I will just put in this code, and the problem will be solved. And to make it even simpler, I could remove this one if I copy this method and I go back to the view, the layout view, which is here, because we were rendering in that thing, and I could change this to that, and that will just save me like one little call, but it's not really a big deal because there was not much going on. So I did make a tiny typo, but I can now remove this one and have it just a bit smaller. So now we are able to insert items. I will now continue, before running the application again, I will immediately continue with the post controller. So I will add a new controller to the system, which will display our details view of the post, which also allows us to update the post. And in that code you'll see the model binder in action again. So let's go to the controller folder and right click the folder and say add a new controller. The wizard starts and I will call it post, and it will prefix it with controller automatically. I will make it just an empty one, and I'm gonna say add. So here we have the newly created post controller, and the post controller obviously needs to be derived from our own base controller. The thing is that we need to pass in the generics. Well, the post controller will be dealing with posts, so I will just give it XPO post as first, and I will deal with the post view model, and that one doesn't exist yet. Let me first resolve this one, and as you might notice, this one cannot be resolved. So let me go to the view models and create a new view model for it. This is going to be a class, and it's called post view model. Well, also for this, the post view model needs to be derived from our own base view model. Let's check. Hey, it was an abstract class, so let's implement it. Oh yeah, now I remember, it were the menu items. So in this case, I want to show the edit item, so I'll say a return true on this, and I don't want to see the insert item, so I'll say a return false on this. That is my base view model. If I go back to the post controller, I will now be able to resolve it. There we are. Now we need to make a few changes to this action methods, because what we want to do is we want to view a post. So you'll see here the get, the URL will be /post. If I go to /post of my site, I will enter this method and it will return an empty field. That's for now, it's not really a big deal. What I want is I want to do a get, which looks a bit, let me put it in comments. Well, this will be my my ID, so that will be a quit. This is how it should look. Well, that is also taken care of by the routing engine of MVC framework. What I will do is I will define action method, and that action method is going to be called details. And MVC framework knows, or the routing engine knows by default, that if I declare a method which is called details, then it knows that it should follow a parameter which will have the ID, and in our case it will be a quit, and again the model binder will take care that the information inside the URL will be converted to a quit. Well, this ID is the selected one, so I will store that in a private variable because I will need it later on. So I will also insert this private field just here. I will also pass on the view data post ID, because that this information needs to be passed on to another partial view, which is the Popup control. I'll deal with that in just a couple of seconds. I will return the view index, and it will use the getModel method. And if you remember, this was also an abstract class, so let me implement the abstract class. And oh yeah, that was the view model. What I'll do here, I will remove this code, and I will paste in a couple of things which you have seen before on the home controller, but slightly different. It will now be a post view model instead of a home view model. And as you can see here, I will do a couple of minor changes. Let me first resolve the query things. Let me first resolve DevExpress XPO to get the query extension methods resolved. And I need to include a namespace, which is our model namespace. So this is all going to work just exactly the way as it worked in the home controller, with a slight detail, because I have changed the where in my link for posts, where I will say the p.id equals the post ID, which I was been setting here. I'm also doing a check on the active. You could decide not to do it, but it's just to show you that you only need to code the differences in those controllers. I will also store this ID in the view model of the current controller, and that was something that I coded in way earlier in the process, and that is also needed to exchange those IDs of the current active blog post. So this is our get model. What we can do next is we need to do the post view partial, which will display. Remember, if I go back to the home controller and I go all the way up, there was this post view partial, and this post view partial will initialize the data view with all the blocks inside. I need this one as well, but I do need to make a couple of minor details to it. So let me get it over and go to the post controller. Let me put it right underneath this one. This post view partial will now be called, because of that URL that has changed slightly, also with that ID. So what I'll do here, I will set the post ID again, so it can be used in the get model function. Then there was another one. Let me get back to the home controller. There was the dashboard pop-up. Also, the dashboard pop-up will be called that width as parameter. So if we go back to my post controller here, I will insert practically the same dashboard pop-up, with the exception that I will have the ID here. The dashboard should be bound to a post model, so not to the home view model or the post view model, but to the model itself. So I will get the model initialized, and from all the posts I take the first one. I know that because there will always be one in this collection. So this is a way of getting it. Then we have, if I go back to the home controller, we can just follow this list, because we need to implement all these action methods and then everything will work. So we will have a dashboard callback, just the same as we have in the home controller. That is also going to look slightly different. Let me get it into the post controller, because here again the model binder will be getting into action. Let me resolve our DevExpress model binder, just like that. What happens in this case is that the post will only contain its ID pre-filled by the model binder, and that is because we are only exchanging the ID, so nothing else can be resolved from the submitted data in the callback yet. So we will have an empty post model object with the only thing set the ID. Well, that's not a big deal, because I will get that ID and I will select the particular post here by querying by ID, and I have my post object filled. Then I will do the same as I did with the callback on the home controller, and I will load the lookup tags, and I will load the lookup groups and return the partial view. And this post has been initialized because of the model binding functionality, which will give me the ID, and I will just look that post up from the database and assign it into this DTO class. So that is basically binding the data in the pop-up. Then last but not least, we'll have the dashboard submit method, which should also be available. Also, that method is pretty much the same for one little detail, which is we'll have the dashboard submit. I will get that post parameter pre-filled with everything that I changed, and instead of doing the db insert, I will do the db update. So this means that we are also able to edit our blocks. But before that can be done, there is one thing that needs to be changed. Because I am dealing with the view data collection to exchange some data to some other views, etc. Yeah, I need to do something with it as well. And that primarily happens in the layout. In the layout I am rendering this dashboard pop-up, and the dashboard pop-up needs to have that ID in case of an edit function. So what I can do here, I can get that ID out of the view data. So this is one thing you can use the view data for, and get it. And this makes the ID available in the creation code of the dashboard pop-up, and I can handle accordingly. So I know that my selected block is actually the one being edited. There is one final thing we need to do to get the post controller in action, and that is we should create an index view for it. So let us go to the views folder. I'm going to create a folder called post, because that is basically the action we are doing, and I'll create an index razor file. So it will be called index. It will be created as partial view, and there we go. And what I could do, because this is pretty much similar as the home, I could also move the index of the home folder inside the shared folder, but I mean this is like a real project, so let me just not do that. Let me copy over the code inside that HTML, because it's literally the same. So I'll put it in here, and I'll render in the post view partial and bind the model to it. Let me run the application and see that everything that we have added works. So here we have the home view, and this was the item that we just created, although we did get an error message, but that was in the end callback because that thing was not going to be updated, the menu. If I click on the more link, you'll see that we will go to the detail view, and you can see that the URL is actually changed in post, details, and the key of this item. You will also see, because of the view model, that the hash sign is being displayed instead of the plus. If I now click the hash, you'll notice that this is all filled in, and if I just change something here and hit OK, it is updated instantly here. And that is done through a separate callback on the data view. Same goes for the menu. In case we are changing some menu things, that will be handled appropriately as well, because we didn't change anything on the JavaScript stuff. We just made a couple of minor changes on the invocation of the JavaScript. So basically we now have the same kind of application that we have on WinForms or WebForms, but then in MVC. And I encourage you to get this code from GitHub and play a bit with it, and you might be able to add some functionality to it yourself. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and have fun with MVC.